everybody. About 6 months ago, we did a show with a very distinguished novelist, Joseph O'Neill. At that point, he had a book out about soccer. Joseph O'Neill on football as the ugly game of neo-colonial exploitation. The novel was called Godwin. And what distinguishes O'Neill's fiction is its complexity, its multi-layered nature of reality, or its representation of reality. And O'Neill himself isn't just a novelist. He's also a writer on our contemporary politics and culture. He writes in particular for the New York Review. So I'm thrilled to have Joe O'Neill back to talk about 2024. His take on the broader culture. Joseph O'Neill, thank you so much for coming back onto the show. What kind of year was 2024 for you?
God, I think it was honestly not a great year. I mean, on a personal level, I had a happy year, but in terms of the global and American political situation in particular, which, as you mentioned, I sort of think about and write about from time to time. It wasn't a great year, obviously. It was a year in which Donald Trump came back to power, and it was a year in which a number of things went backwards, and particularly, I feel, climate change, the politics around climate change seems to have gone into reverse. And so I'm sort of like a lot of people, I'm feeling a little bit gloomy about the situation we find ourselves in at this moment. And the other feature, I think, which emerged this year is the rise of Elon Musk and the power of the kind of American oligarchs. That became a sort of, I think, a kind of salient thing, and of course, from my point of view, not good thing.
Back in August, you wrote Kamala Palooza, which was reasonably hopeful about Harris. How disappointed were you with the Harris campaign and with obviously its failure in the general election in November?
I felt like, I mean, I'm not someone who really attributes enormous significance to campaign management. You know, that I'm not someone who believes that if Kamala Harris had done this, that, or the other a little bit better, it would have resulted in victory over Donald Trump. I feel like, bearing in mind her strengths and her limitations, I thought Kamala did rather well, acquitted herself rather well. But of course, my emphasis is on the first thing, which is her limitations. I mean, I don't feel like if there had been time for a primary, and if the Democratic Party had been sufficiently healthy to sort of choose someone after a primary who was kind of the best person they had to offer, they would have come up with Kamala Harris. And in fact, I was not a Harris fan, but she did do two things. She saved us from the Biden catastrophe, and I feel like it's surely incontestable that if Biden had persisted with his wish to contest the election as a candidate, it would have been an utter calamity for the Democrats, not just for the presidential election, but for the House and the Senate as well. And so she spared us. She spared us that outcome, and she also, I felt, bearing in mind the restrictions, as I said, having to do with her personality and her characteristics, and having to do with the political situation generally, I thought she did pretty well at rallying parts of the Democratic base, so that at least the grassroots came out and was sufficiently motivated and hopeful to almost win the House in fairly adverse political conditions. So I'm not someone who's losing sleep about Kamala's campaign and thinking that she could have won. The thing that surprised me the most about the election is the strength of the Trump brand. It's quite extraordinary to me how many people, I mean, and I'm talking about low propensity voters. I'm not talking about the kind of voters who follow politics all the time, but the kind of low propensity, low info voters, as they're actually known in the trade, came out in favor of Trump. And even though Trump, didn't run a good campaign, he ran a really bad campaign, if you ask me. And in fact, there's some, if you look at the battleground states where Harris campaigned and Trump campaigned, Harris actually did better in the battleground states than she did in kind of in other states, and where neither campaign was particularly visible. So Trump did very well in terms of his own brand versus the Harris brand, and I was surprised. I mean, I didn't realize that his kind of strongman, slightly kind of, this kind of strongman campaign that he ran, a campaign which one would really associate with sort of tin pot kind of elections of the 1970s somewhere in Central America or South Latin America or Africa, countries which did not have, in those days, mature democracies, did not have mature middle classes. He ran a campaign which wasn't like the campaigns that we've been taught to respect and to sort of appreciate in the United States. And he won. And I think that he won not because of his campaigning, but because of his brand as a kind of strongman billionaire.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. I know you have some very strong feelings, particularly on some of the young men who voted for Trump. But before we get there, I'm curious, as you're mostly known as a novelist, a very sophisticated novelist. When you watch that first debate between Biden and Trump, when it was clear that Biden was completely unsuitable for office, did a fictional light bulb go off in your head? What did you think when you were watching it? It was so odd, wasn't it?
I mean, everything is odd. It's like a really kind of terrible cable TV show. The sort of degeneracy of Joe Biden, the physical and mental and moral degeneracy of Joe Biden it was happening in front of our eyes. You wouldn't believe it, and it's sort of shocking. And I remember before I came to the United States being slightly bewildered and enchanted, not enchanted in the sense of feeling lots of sort of approbation, but kind of like mesmerized by this kind of semi-fictional. Hold on, that's my dogs. We don't mind that, do we?
No, we love dogs on this show.
So yeah, it was an extraordinary performance, and at the same time, similar kind of things were going on with Trump. I mean, not in terms of his senility, but in terms of his obvious unfitness for office. And so yeah, it has never even occurred to me to sort of try and write a fictional kind of account of what has happened in this election or in American politics this year, because it's so debased, it's so cartoonish. It's kind of like, it's as if the political sensibility of the United States has been so dumbed down now, that and so coarsened, that it's a kind of a really like one of those crummy cable TV shows that
Who warned us about this, Joe, in fictional terms? I often think of DeLillo. Maybe he's someone who comes to mind. Did anyone else on the fictional front warn us about what would happen to America in the 2020s, in the sense, as you said, that the whole thing has become like a coarse cable television, reality television show?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think there have been obviously dystopian visions of the United States and accounts of the United States history by many writers. I feel like what's actually happened here is beyond the scope of the prophetic scope of most writers, and that is the internet and its pervasiveness, and the algorithms that propel its audiences has created what I sometimes refer to as a kind of postmodern politics, which is to say that even the material conditions of the country are not accessible in the way that they used to be. Obviously, if you had a gigantic calamity and we were sort of we all had wheelbarrows full of kind of billions of worthless dollars, and we were ships, like the Germans did in the aftermath, or in the 1920s, after the aftermath of the Great Crash, then we would have direct access to some sort of reality, potentially. But I feel like American voters are now so delusional about the basic facts of the country, the basic facts of their circumstances, that it's almost as if what I would call modern politics, which is to say politics in which the main propaganda and information vectors emanate from the state rather than from corporations and private oligarchs, or social media in this case, has been completely surpassed. I mean, it used to be that Walter Cronkite was the sort of person who the average United States kind of citizen would go to for a kind of objective and unifying view of what's going on in the world. But that is simply not available anymore. And in this election, I think about half the voters, if not more, were convinced that the United States was in a recession.
I want to get to that, and I want to obviously get to the internet and Fox News's contribution. But I wonder on the Biden front whether the supposed mainstream media, the high-end progressive media, the coastal media, New York Times, Washington Post, have a responsibility for not really telling the truth about Biden. They all chose not to really reveal his state, which was unsuitable to be president, and so it got revealed to us in that debate. I mean, does traditional media, I take your point on the internet, and you're certainly not the first or the last person to make that point, but does mainstream media, the supposed responsible media of the Times and the Post, does it have a responsibility here too in not telling the truth about what was really going on?
Yes, of course it does. And of course they failed to discharge it. And what was so electrifying in a bad way about that debate was to see for ourselves how unwell Biden is or was. And of course now, since the election, there have been these stories that have been trickling out that, in fact, his entourage was fully aware that he had good days and bad days, quote unquote, and that on bad days they wouldn't trouble him with work. And this is the sort of number one person in the United States, the most powerful person in the world, and who is still at this point trying to seek another 4 years in power. I do feel like there was a lot of kind of basic coverage of the fact that Biden was too old, and in fact, if anything, a lot of the Biden fans would complain that the press was making too much of Biden's age, certainly by comparison with Trump, who was only a year or two younger, and of course the mainstream media has failed in that regard, but I feel like the main responsibility lies with Biden and his people. And I mean, it was always my sense of Biden that he was a guy he was one of those guys who wanted to be president at age 12. He wanted to live it was a very private and personal ambition of his to sit in the Oval Office and to go down in history as a great man. And he had this enormous vanity and narcissism. And of course, we paid for it in the end, because obviously now it becomes clear that he should have obviously not run for office. He should have made it clear that he wasn't going to be president for any longer than one term. Of course, it's a very difficult question whether or not, if he'd done that, the Democrats would have found somebody who could beat Trump. I'm personally skeptical.
Yeah, and we'll never know, of course. You gave a very interesting interview to the New York Review of Books in November about the election after it was determined who won. You used the F word. It's controversial. Some people believe that Trump is a fascist or that there are fascism in Trump's ideology. Others dismiss it. And I'm quoting you here. You said, "My sense is that in this era of the internet, there are millions more fascists in this country than people think, young men in particular." It's quite a, I don't know if it's a radical thing to say, Joe, but it's not something that everyone agrees on. What do you mean by fascism? Is Trump, is there elements of the MAGA movement of Trump? Is it fascism in a classical sense, or are you using the word more broadly?
Well, I mean, first of all, fascism in the classical sense, is not a concept that I'm particularly attached to. History doesn't repeat itself identically, and fascisms vary over time. I mean, the fascism that Trump has on offer is essentially a vision for America in which he remains president, in violation of the constitutional kind of term limits, prohibition on people serving more than twice. And if there's no question in my mind, I don't think in anyone's mind, and that if Trump could have his way, there would be no more elections, and he would just remain president indefinitely. So he's certainly a would-be fascist. Whether he can succeed in doing it is another matter. He's already attempted once. January 4 years ago, exactly, pretty much, he attempted to overturn the election of Joe Biden. So there's not really much question about his wish to sort of become a sort of election-free authoritarian. And then once he's done that, is he then a fascist? I don't know. In terms of, does he have the kind of socio-economic program of the kind of far-right politicians in the 1920s? I doubt it, but it'd be much more close to something like sort of Pinochet or something more modern. Than the kind of Hitler. I do feel like since he got elected, he's done at least two things which are completely kind of consistent with the analysis that he's a fascist. The first, he's actually started threatening to annex Canada, Panama, potentially Greenland. He's actually just talking about it as if it was a normal kind of thing to do. And that, of course, fascism, certainly in the 1930s and 40s, involved kind of aggressive wars of aggression against neighbors and expansionism at the expense of sovereign peoples. So he's very much kind of interested in that, and I've further thoughts about whether or not that could happen. And the other thing he did was to sue the pollster in Iowa.
Yeah.
Before the election, had produced a poll showing him losing or trailing to Joe Biden in Iowa. And of course, that poll proved to be wrong, but it didn't stop Donald Trump from suing this person to prevent essentially negative prognostications about the elections, and which strikes me as a classically authoritarian thing to do, and it's certainly not consistent with kind of what we think of as democracy. So yeah, I do think that he certainly wants to be a fascist. The conditions of postmodernity in which he would seek to rule are very interesting and without precedent, because it used to be that to brainwash people, it would be the state that would be doing that. Would be modern fascism and modern brainwashing would be the state and organs of ideology. These states' ideological apparatuses who would tell us how to think and make, and like the communists, for example, the state would run that. Now, Trump would be working in collaboration with kind of oligarchs controlling social media and television, and that's how the kind of reality, American sense of their reality and their political kind of situation would be kind of controlled by that set up rather than simply the state.
And of course, Musk's ownership of X. What about young men? You write about young men in particular. What has happened in your view to young American men? All sorts of writing has been done, new institutes. Richard Reeves, who's been on this show a few times, has a new institute in Washington, D.C., focused on the supposed crisis of young men. What's your take, Joe, on this?
Well, I speak as a father of 3 young men, and so I've been exposed to lots and lots, and as a college professor, so I've been exposed to lots and lots of kind of young men in the last 10 years, and it's been I think on any view it's been a difficult decade to be in your early 20s or mid 20s, even late 20s. There was because this is a group of this is a demographic that is essentially kind of cannon fodder for social media. This is the first generation of young men to sort of, as it were, be told, it's like this battle of the Somme. They're sort of
I thought of that when you talk about cannon fodder. So just as the young men in 1914 were killed on the Somme, they send the young men to Facebook and X and TikTok now.
And Rogan and all the other podcasts and influencers and YouTube in particular. Lots and lots of kind of essentially defenseless young men who are also, it should be added, at the sort of sharp end of the kind of YouTube Me Too movement, and COVID. So social isolation, electronic kind of exploitation of their consciousness by electronic media, and a kind of very aggressive and historic moment in kind of in feminism, which I think a lot of young men experienced that it was at their own expense, has been fertile in persuading lots of them that to adopt kind of cynical, nihilistic point of view, and of course, as soon as you do that, it becomes not difficult to sort of take refuge. The whole incel movement, for example, that's a new thing. The idea of I mean, you and I will remember from our own times as young men when involuntary celibacy was just something you had as a young man, and characterized pretty much every young man. But it wasn't a social movement, and it wasn't seen as an outrage, and it was just seen as something that you went through. Like you can't, not everyone can have a girlfriend when you're 19 or 20 or 23, and but so all sorts of things were happening in the ideological sphere. And these young men were kind of inexperienced. It sort of reminds me in some ways of the sort of drug deaths that occurred in the 1970s and even 80s, when young people were exposed to drugs without, which were quite a new thing in those days. And there were lots and lots of overdoses and kind of bad things happening in relation to drugs, which happens less now, and smoking as well. Everyone smoked, including me. So there were all sorts of things that you're not necessarily defended against. There's all sorts of hazards, and I feel like that's what's produced.
But Joe, some people might say, well, you're maybe not you, but this helicopter parent generation. There are always going to be hazards: smoking, drugs, the internet.
Yeah, there are.
YouTube,
but not fascism.
Girls, sex, too much sex, not enough sex, sexual diseases, not enough sexual diseases, COVID. I mean, that's just life, isn't it? And why do we talk about young men when some young men might say, well, we like YouTube, we like Rogan. Who is Joe O'Neill or Andrew Dean to tell us that we shouldn't be watching or listening to these people?
I don't think Rogan is a fascist. I think Trump is a fascist, and I think that the movement, the MAGA movement, is essentially a fascist, and certainly has become a fascist movement. And I think that, but that wasn't a hazard that people faced before. I think the internet is new. The world in which, I mean, I just don't know. To be honest, I have no idea what it would be like to grow up as a teenager with the internet accessible to me. I mean, that wasn't a hazard that I had to face.
Well, you'd have all the knowledge at your fingertips. You'd you wouldn't need to use maps. You could buy anything anywhere you went. You could get airline tickets. You might be able to have a lot of fun. You could find girlfriends online at some of the social networks. So there is some upside to the internet, isn't there?
I mean, I suppose there is. I mean, this conversation
exactly. We would
not
so
be
you note in the New York Review article that people aren't obviously reading enough, and that sometimes perhaps we need to go back to the classics, to Arendt and Primo Levi, who made sense of their reality. Do we need to reread Arendt and Levi? Of course, Arendt, who writes so brilliantly about totalitarianism, and Levi on the experience of the death camps. Is there a need to historicize this, or are there other kinds of writers you would encourage people to read apart from yourself, of course?
Well, no, I think that what I was sort of actually concerned about when I was writing about that was, I mean, I think that one of the problems we're having in the United States is that the realm of politics has been very, very professionalized. So that we have a limited sort of person, or a very specific sort of person with strengths and weaknesses involved, for example, in running the Democratic Party. Like if I wanted to become a Democrat, which I don't, but if I wanted to, I would have to sort of have to run a gauntlet of fundraising, I'd have to run a gauntlet of kind of like networking. There are all sorts of ways in which a very specific person flourishes within the political realm. I mean, that's always been the case, but it turns out that if you're dealing with an extraordinary political situation, as we are now, with a Republican Party that seems intent on one-party rule, that the kind of thinking that is maybe required to sort of kind of see off that threat isn't the sort of thinking that sort of it produces someone like Chuck Schumer or Dick Durbin,
Kamala Harris,
or Kamala Harris. Exactly. I mean, Kamala Harris is a very specific kind of ambitious person who has certain strengths, but a kind of rounded political vision isn't one of them. And it may even be that the kind of person, I mean, you look at what happened in the Second World War in England. Chamberlain, who was a great kind of domestic prime minister with all sorts of aptitudes and skills, and turned out to be kind of hopeless when confronted with the threat presented by the Axis powers. And Churchill, who was a complete idiot in many ways, couldn't get anything right, suddenly became the person that they needed. He did have the sort of vision and charisma that was needed to unite the country and to sort of face this enemy and defeat it. So even someone like I mean, they were talking about. I saw somebody suggesting the other day that if Donald Trump decides to run again for a third term, it would mean that Barack Obama could run again as well. And they were sort of suggesting essentially that Barack Obama would kind of comfortably beat Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument. You talk in the interview about the need for the Democratic Party to reinvent itself. They're not going to find a Winston Churchill. I'm guessing, or if there is a Winston Churchill in America, is more likely to come from the Republican Party. How should then, Joe, the Dems reinvent themselves if they're to liberate themselves from this narrow technocratic professionalism, from the Pete Buttigieg's and Kamala Harris's of the world? Where do they look? Where are the new leaders going to come from, and the new ideas?
Well, I mean, I want to start off by saying that the one thing the Democrats have got going for them, and it's in spite of themselves, is their grassroots. So that they've won pretty much every single election since 2017 that could be every single winnable election has been won. It's only even in November they won all sorts of House races and did very well in the Senate, bearing in mind the fact that Harris was losing badly to Trump. So so they've got this enormous power that the Republicans don't have. The Republicans used to have very strong Tea Party type grassroots, but that seems to have withered away in many ways. And I sort of feel like the first thing that they have to do is not squander is to acknowledge that this is their number one electoral resource and not dissipate it. So make sure you don't mess up the whole grassroots thing. And at the moment, there's a problem. There's a danger they're going to do that, and they'll stop winning all these special elections. So that's the kind of stop the bleeding. The stop the bleeding is to recognize where things are going, what organs are working well, and to preserve those organs. The second issue about what the Democrats need to do. Well, when I've written for the New York Review of Books, it's always invariably been about the Democratic Party and what it should do. And for years, I've been saying they need a strong partisan adversarial brand. They can't brand themselves as, or they've tried to brand themselves as the party of reasonableness and centrism and all the rest of it, and it just hasn't worked. Certainly not to the extent of beating Trump. So I feel like it's a huge, gigantic, almost cancerous sort of thing, the Democratic Party, with it sort of grows and shrivels here and there sort of erratically. But one thing that is going to happen, which I think is important, is that in early February, there will be an election for the head of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and the chair of the DNC. My feeling, the one thing they have to do is to empower that person to take control to a significant degree of party branding and party messaging and strategy, adversarial political strategy. They've never had that before. The Democratic Party has never had a kind of centralized political operation. Which is, the DNC has always been a kind of a place where party stalwarts are rewarded for their service.
And it's interesting, in your New York Review interview, you talk about the Democratic Party sort of re-centralizing or reconfiguring, and a lot of the initiatives coming out of New York, not the city, but the state where you live. Why do you think that, and how would that work?
Well, again, I think that there's a guy called Ben Wickler, who's the head of the Wisconsin Democrats, who's running for the DNC. He'd be a brilliant national leader. He would have to persuade. His problem would be the Democrats themselves, not the grassroots or the mass, you or me or anyone else who's kind of vaguely interested in preservation of our American democracy. His problem would be saying to very powerful careerist people in the Democratic Party, like Jerry Connolly, who insisted on being the oversight chair, even though he's 75 years old and has cancer. You
can't make this stuff up, right?
It's pathological. The careerism of DC Democrats is a disease.
And the gerontocratic nature, and a lot of it has to do with age. You talked about the crisis of young men or young people in America because of the internet. And there's also a crisis of this sort of this gerontocracy where people are unwilling to give up power. Nancy Pelosi, of course, is a prime example here. Why these people just won't retire. We had that with Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. We have it with all sorts of elected officials.
And we have it with Sotomayor. I mean, my feeling is that I'm speaking as a former lawyer. In the United Kingdom, where I practiced in England and Wales at the bar there, they have their own Supreme Court, and I appeared in front of that Supreme Court. It wasn't called the Supreme Court then; it was called something else. They have term limits. You're aged out, age 70. I think they may have extended.
It's pretty generous. I mean, 70, you get a good chunk of time, yeah.
And 70 is like, and someone like Sotomayor, I don't know how long she's been on the Supreme Court, 20 years, 15 years. I mean, it's not like she just got appointed yesterday. Is 70, and it's not what has various physical kind of problems. And you would have thought that, is it so? And I don't understand what it is about American culture in particular that makes people so kind of anxious to hang on to power.
It's particularly odd in America, which has always prided itself on its youthful culture. So for better or worse, I think you and I will agree that it's generally for worse. Trump's going to come to power next month. You have an interesting take. You say it's our job to make Trump fail again, fail worse in your New York Review interview. In that sense, you're you remind me of the Republican response to the Obama election. Do you think that the Democrats should basically copy the way in which the Republicans greeted, so to speak, Obama?
I don't think they have to copy it, because I mean, Obama. I mean, the thing is, when Obama came to power, the absolute resistance that he encountered involved kind of all sorts of kind of lies, essentially, and hijinks to sort of create scandals and that didn't really exist. So they didn't have much to work on. I do feel that you can't enable fascism. You can't enable this Republican Party, no matter how you want to label it. There's no harm in adopting what would be seen as a completely straightforward political posture anywhere else in Europe, which is to say adversarial. Like if you come to power in again, I'm going to take London as an example. In England, you don't, as a Tory or as a Labour, you don't expect any votes from the other side. You don't expect them to stand up at the dispatch box and congratulate you on your achievements and talk about bipartisanship. That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in other countries either. It's kind of entirely normal to have a normal adversarial relationship in which everything is contested, and I feel like that hasn't been tried by the Democrats. And I know what they would say. They'd say, well, if you look at focus groups, what the focus groups wants is bipartisanship. They want real solutions and all the rest of it. Well, we've tried that for years, and it just doesn't penetrate the electorate for electoral purposes. I mean, Biden really was the most, I mean, who I consider a war criminal and guilty of genocide. I do have to concede to him that he did a brilliant job.
Say that again. You say Biden is a war criminal and responsible for genocide. You mean on Gaza?
Yeah, I mean on Gaza. Yeah, I think he knowingly armed Netanyahu, who himself is under indictment now by the ICC, and would be so. But in substance, I feel like maybe that. And again, international criminal law was something I did all this stuff. Some of this stuff with in relation to, and looked at it quite carefully in relation to Milosevic and all those issues. I feel there's a
so
very,
are you
very clear
leveling Trump and Biden? I mean, even Trump in his first term, no one ever accused him of enabling genocide.
No, I agree. I'm not leveling them. I'm just saying that that's a characteristic which Biden has, that characteristic, that of being a war criminal, but he has other things going for him. Biden is not seeking to destroy the planet. Trump is.
Joe, what about you? You're presenting this. I'm quoting. You said you can't enable fascism. Some people might be listening to this. Maybe young people. We know the recent tragic case of Luigi Mangione, who felt he had the right to assassinate a CEO of a healthcare company for his supposed immorality. The kind of message you're putting forward about Trump destroying the planet, being fascist, and your argument that we need to make Trump fail, that it's a form of resistance. Do you feel you're flirting with the suggestion that one has the right to use violence to resist Trump?
Well, I haven't actually said anything like that.
But some people might, some less sophisticated, perhaps adult thinkers might put this argument together and think, well, I have the right to go and assassinate Trump. If he's going to destroy the planet, then I'm going to destroy him before he destroys the planet.
Well, I mean, it's that thing of like, should someone have shot Hitler in the 1930s? Would that?
But is that an equivalent of shooting Hitler and shooting Trump?
No, I don't think it is. But it's in that realm of argument. It's very speculative. The problem with ethical arguments about political violence is that they mostly resolve themselves in terms of their efficacy. I mean, that is, if there's one thing we know is wrong, it's violence that doesn't work, because then it's just been a complete waste of time. But if violence works, then you have to then a different conversation.
What do you make of the Luigi Mangione assassination?
Well, it sort of reminds me. I mean, the thing is, there are two ways of thinking about that assassination. The first is to take a kind of, I suppose, psychologically and legally kind of realistic view of it, and view him as a kind of disturbed individual who whose motivations are not yet clear, and we don't even, and he is pleading not guilty, and who seems to be deranged, like so many of these gunmen. Just another example of a deranged American with a gun who has shot the. So there's that way of looking at it, which has a lot of validity. And then there's the other way of looking at it, is to sort of make him a kind of icon of a sort of fantasy, and the fantasy being that he's in fact a political warrior, and that he's conducting an act of a politically righteous act of violence, and he should be viewed in that way. Of course, the problem with the latter analysis is that it does seem to be rather fantastical to attribute to this guy these kind of motivations. But I do feel like I remember growing up, and I suspect you do too, in a world in which political violence was common.
Well, we had the Baader-Meinhof and the
It
Red
was-
Brigades, where the arguments
We
and
had
the
the
IRA,
IRA.
where the arguments were made by certain people on the left that they had the right to resist.
Yeah, and I have to say that the arguments of the Baader-Meinhof were so abstract and so obviously kind of ineffectual. Their strategy was so ineffective that and the same thing with the Red Brigade in Italy, that there were very few people who supported them. Very, very few people. They were in fact understood as a kind of easily understood as this kind of after this kind of this residue from a kind of idea of revolution that sort of expired in the 1960s, and these were the last kind of symptoms of that idea. Because of course in those days socialism was widespread. I grew up, as I'm sure you may have done, in a world in which all the utilities were owned by the state, even the airlines were owned by the state. So it was a very kind of socialist time. And so there wasn't much scope for sort of revolutionary Marxist violence. But in Ireland, it was a different story. In Ireland, you had...
And you're half Irish, so you speak
colonial-
with a certain...
I do. I speak, and then my father was in the IRA, and so it was his.
And
brother,
you wrote
my grandfather
an
was, and so-
autobiography, Blood Dark Track, about your two grandfathers.
Yes, both of whom were interned during the Second World War. One Turkish grandfather interned by the British in Palestine, and the Irish grandfather who was interned by the Irish in Ireland on suspicion of being an IRA member. And so the IRA, the question of the political violence of the IRA, was it justified or not, was a very, very contested one. But the thing that happened then is that with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the arguments against the violence became kind of more difficult. I know it's horrible to say, and I wasn't an IRA supporter during their campaigns of violence. I wasn't. But if you kind of say, well, hold on a second, if you redeem the political violence by achieving a historic peace agreement which settles essentially the dispute that was the subject of the violence, a dispute going on for centuries, then in many ways you can start to say, well, would it have happened without the violence? Was the violence efficacious? And once it's efficacious, then you sort of ask yourself, I mean, look at the violence that led to the state of Israel. Israel was created out of violence. It required all sorts of massacres, ethnic cleansing, and so on of Arabs to accomplish the creation of what we now know as Israel. And again, the justification for that was that it worked, and the international legal authorities recognized it, and recognized essentially and legitimized it. So, I mean, on the question of Mangione, I thought there's an argument to be made that, and a lot of people I think have made it, which is that in the absence of efficacious political kind of mechanisms to hold accountable the corporations who are kind of dominating our lives and our health, and potentially our future as citizens, as inhabitants of this planet, in the absence of any kind of democratically viable mechanisms, then political violence becomes logical. I mean, of course, I'm not making that argument, but I'm just saying that that is an argument which is now certainly is an argument worth listening to at this point.
Very interesting. Finally, Joe, you've been very generous with your time. You gave an interview back in 2014 saying, it's not my fault if every time I sit down to write, something big happens on whether it's Obama or 9/11 or now Trump. As I said, your last book, Godwin, was written at a time of enormous historical interest. What about the responsibility of a Joe O'Neill, a writer, a fiction writer, and perhaps a non-fiction writer in these times? Do you feel you have a particular responsibility? You write novels, you also write non-fiction for the New York Review of Books, you do other stuff, you're involved in politics. Do writers like yourself have a particular responsibility in such uncertain, worrying times?
I don't think so. I mean, the responsibility is a permanent one, which is to be as truthful as you can possibly be and to scrutinize the world without fear. And that's a responsibility which is kind of normally discharged kind of without too much difficulty. It's just that, if you keep, I mean, there's a reason why they suddenly start rounding up the poets. The poets are writing poetry for years, nothing happens, nobody listens. They keep writing the same poems, except, potentially, turning their sort of attention to what's going on in a slightly different way. And then suddenly people start paying attention to them. I don't think it's the responsibility of writers to be politically kind of up to date or anything. I do feel like as long as they're truthful, then they're doing their job. And by truthful, I mean, and that's a complicated issue of how artistic writing, fiction creates truth. But as long as they're being truthful, then I think they're doing their job. I mean, for my part, I totally separate the idea of my fiction from my political activity. I feel like writing an essay or having this discussion is miles away from how I'm thinking when I'm writing a story.
Well, let me revise the question. I apologize for one final question. As a novelist, there are very few writers who are more committed to the principle of a global world. Netherlands in particular, your background, your sensibility is deeply global. As the world shifts, as Trump goes off nationalist, authoritarian, starts talking about acquiring Greenland or Canada or Mexico, as we go back to some sort of Monroe Doctrine, as China and Russia are doing the same thing. What becomes of an internationalist like yourself? You're in Washington, you're in New York City, you teach at Bard, which is again a highly international liberal place. But what becomes of an internationalist in the age of nationalism, in this new nationalism?
I mean, no one's listening to us anyway.
I hope someone is.
So it's not. It's not as if the internationalists are ruling things. I mean, the person you would have to ask Elon Musk, because Elon Musk is internationalism used to be the province of sort of cosmopolitan idealists, people with theories about how the autonomy of the individual is not maximized by membership of the nation state, it's maximized by the membership in an international community and all the rest of it. Now that discussion is just sort of dissolving in many ways, and it's being replaced by a kind of transnational class of oligarchs who rise above, form alliances essentially, and rise above the kind of constraints of the law, because if you they're so rich that they sort of become immune to the law somehow, and for various reasons, and various people have written about that, I think that so you have the true globalists are people like Elon Musk, who wants to sort of dismantle the United States' political tradition, its constitutional tradition, in favor of a kind of international network of kind of corrupt kind of billionaires, kind of managing these sort of slightly antiquated kind of structures of the nation state for their own benefit. That's the internationalist, as it were, or post-nationalist kind of vista that currently offers itself. And the right, I don't think the right has got much that they can say in the face of such a thing, other than to describe it as.
Well, Joe O'Neill, I'm not sure whether you've given any reason to celebrate the new year, but I hope you have a wonderful new year, happy and healthy one. And we will talk again in 2025, because your voice is an important one, and we're living in particularly interesting times. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.